Marcus Johnson stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his simple blue tie and checking his reflection one last time. He deliberately chose to wear his most basic suit, nothing that would hint at his true net worth of over $50 million. At 35, he had built his tech company from scratch, but today he was just another potential tenant looking for an apartment. The Oakwood Heights apartment complex stood proud in one of the city's most desired neighborhoods. Its red brick exterior and manicured lawns screamed exclusivity, exactly the kind of place where Marcus wanted to conduct his social experiment. Walking into the rental office, Marcus immediately noticed how the secretary's welcoming smile faltered slightly when she saw him. He had seen that look before, the quick double take, the slight hesitation, the forced politeness. "Good morning," Marcus said warmly. "I have an appointment with Mr. Cooper about the one-bedroom apartment." "Oh, yes." The secretary, whose nameplate read Linda, typed something into her computer. "Please have a seat. Mr. Cooper will be with you shortly." Marcus sat down, purposely pulling out an older model phone instead of his latest iPhone. He had created a complete alternate identity for this experiment, complete with bank statements showing a modest but sufficient income as a mid-level IT specialist. 20 minutes passed. Marcus noticed 3 other potential tenants, all white, came in after him and were immediately attended to by other staff members. He simply observed, mentally taking notes. Finally, Richard Cooper emerged from his office. He was a tall man in his 50s, with graying hair and an expensive watch that he seemed to adjust constantly. His eyes scanned the waiting area, passed over Marcus, then returned with barely concealed surprise. "Mr. Johnson?" Cooper's voice carried a note of disbelief. "Yes, that's me." Marcus stood up, extending his hand. Cooper hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking it. Inside Cooper's office, the landlord's demeanor remained stiff and professional. "So, you're interested in Unit 4B?" Cooper asked, shuffling through papers without making eye contact. "Yes, I saw it online. The location is perfect for my commute to the IT firm where I work." Cooper's questions came rapid fire. "How long have you been at your current job? Any pets? Do you play musical instruments? At parties? How many people will be living with you?" Marcus answered each question patiently, noting how Cooper seemed to be searching for any reason to disqualify him. He had prepared thoroughly, making sure his fake background was immaculate. "The rent is $2,000 per month," Cooper said, emphasizing the number, "plus a security deposit of 2 months' rent up front." "That won't be a problem," Marcus replied calmly, sliding over his prepared documentation, proof of income, credit report, and references. Cooper examined the papers with unusual scrutiny. "Your credit score is surprisingly good," he remarked, unable to hide his astonishment. "I'm very careful with my finances," Marcus responded modestly. "Well," Cooper said, leaning back in his chair, "we have several other applications to consider. The apartment is in high demand. We'll need to do background checks, verify employment." He trailed off, clearly hoping Marcus would be discouraged. Instead, Marcus pulled out his checkbook. "I understand completely. I'm happy to pay the application fee now, and I can provide the security deposit as soon as you approve my application." Cooper seemed taken aback by Marcus's preparedness. "Right. Well, the application fee is $150. Non-refundable, of course." "Of course." Marcus wrote the check, maintaining his pleasant demeanor despite Cooper's obvious discomfort. As Marcus left the rental office that day, he could hear Cooper immediately pick up the phone. He smiled to himself, knowing that his references, actually employees from his company, would confirm his fake identity perfectly. In his car, Marcus finally allowed himself to process what he had just experienced. The subtle discrimination, the extra hurdles, the thinly veiled surprise at his qualifications. It was all sickeningly familiar, even in 2025. He started his car, his mind already planning the next steps in his experiment. Little did Richard Cooper know that his new prospective tenant was not only a millionaire, but also someone who had just recorded their entire interaction with a hidden camera built into his tie clip. Marcus hadn't built a successful tech company without learning how to plan ahead, and this was just the beginning. As he drove away from Oakwood Heights, Marcus sent a quick text to his lawyer. "Phase 1 complete, exactly as we expected." The real test would be seeing if Cooper would find a way to reject his perfect application, and Marcus was more than prepared for that possibility. 2 weeks after moving into Oakwood Heights, Marcus started noticing the subtle patterns. His keen entrepreneur's mind, trained to spot trends and analyze data, couldn't help but document every small incident that unfolded around him. It started with the maintenance requests. His neighbor Sarah, a white woman in apartment 4A, had called about a leaking faucet on Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, it was fixed. Meanwhile, the Rodriguez family in 4C had been waiting 3 weeks for their broken heating to be repaired, despite the chilly autumn weather. Marcus sat at his simple IKEA desk, maintaining a detailed spreadsheet of every interaction he observed. He had installed discrete security cameras in his apartment, carefully hidden and not damaging any walls, following lease agreements, which recorded every unexpected inspection Cooper conducted. One Thursday afternoon, while Marcus was working on his laptop, maintaining his cover as a modest IT specialist, Cooper appeared at his door unannounced. Surprise inspection, Cooper announced, not waiting for an invitation before stepping inside. We've had complaints about unauthorized occupants in this unit. Marcus, who lived alone and rarely had visitors, simply smiled. Really? That's interesting. From which neighbors? Cooper's face tightened. We don't disclose that information, but I need to check every room. As Cooper prowled through the apartment, Marcus noticed him taking photos of the smallest things, a coffee mug left on the counter, a jacket hung over a chair. Meanwhile, his hidden cameras recorded Cooper's every move, including the man's muttered comments when he thought Marcus couldn't hear. Later that evening, Marcus watched Mrs. Chen from 4D struggling with her groceries. Cooper walked right past her without offering help, but rushed to assist a white tenant moments later. Marcus helped Mrs. Chen with her bags, and during their conversation, learned that she too had been subjected to frequent random inspections. Third time this month, she confided, her voice tired. Always finding something wrong. Last week, he said my cooking smells were disturbing other tenants. Marcus added this information to his growing document. He had also noticed Cooper's different tone during tenant meetings. When white tenants raised concerns, they were valid issues to be addressed. When minority tenants spoke up, there were complaints that needed to be evaluated. One morning, Marcus received an official warning letter about excessive noise during quiet hours. The letter claimed multiple neighbors had complained about loud music and parties. Marcus smiled, knowing his cameras would show he had been out of town on business during the dates mentioned. During his daily jog around the complex, Marcus observed Cooper giving a tour to a prospective tenant, a young white couple. Cooper's demeanor was completely different. Warm, welcoming, even jovial. The same man who had scrutinized Marcus's perfect application was now saying, "We can probably expedite the process for you folks." Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez in 4C. They're raising our rent by 30%. Cooper says it's market adjustment. But Sarah in 4 told me her rent only went up 5%. That evening, while Marcus was preparing a simple dinner, deliberately keeping his cooking subtle to avoid any complaints, he heard Cooper in the hallway. Through his security system's audio, he caught Cooper talking to Linda, the secretary. "We need to document everything," Cooper was saying. "These people need to learn they can't just move into any neighborhood they want. One bad tenant can bring down the whole property value." Marcus added this quote to his evidence file, which was growing larger by the day. He had been recording every incident, every disparity in treatment, every random inspection. His hidden cameras had caught Cooper using racial slurs when he thought no one was listening. As Marcus sat down with his dinner, he received another warning letter under his door, this time about unauthorized decorations in his windows. He had no decorations in his windows. Adding this letter to his collection, Marcus checked his phone, where a private message from his company's board of directors waited. Quarterly earnings exceeded projections. New contracts signed. Total company value now at $80 million. Marcus smiled, thinking about Cooper's face when he eventually learned that his problem tenant could buy the entire building without blinking. But that wasn't the point of this exercise. This wasn't about money, it was about justice. He carefully filed the new warning letter in his growing collection of evidence, knowing that each piece was another nail in Cooper's coffin. The red flags weren't just warnings anymore, They were becoming a noose of Cooper's own making. The situation at Oakwood Heights reached a boiling point during the third month of Marcus's residency. Cooper's tactics shifted from subtle discrimination to blatant harassment, unknowingly providing Marcus with exactly the evidence he needed. One Tuesday morning, Marcus woke up to find notices plastered on his door about multiple lease violations. The other minority tenants had similar notices, while the white tenants' doors remained clear. Marcus calmly took photos of every door in the hallway, adding to his already substantial documentation. "Mr. Johnson," Cooper's voice rang out as Marcus was leaving for his pretended job. "We need to discuss your continued lease violations." Marcus turned, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Which violations are those, Mr. Cooper?" "Your guests, the noise, the cooking smells, the unauthorized modifications to the apartment." Cooper's face was red with barely contained anger. "We have strict policies here at Oakwood Heights." Marcus's hidden camera captured Cooper's aggressive posture and threatening tone. "I live alone, Mr. Cooper. I haven't had any guests except my sister last weekend. I don't cook often, and I haven't modified anything in the apartment." "Don't lie to me." Cooper's voice rose. "Several tenants have complained about groups of people coming and going at all hours." Mrs. Chen, who was getting her mail, spoke up unexpectedly. "That's not true. Marcus is the quietest neighbor I've ever had." Cooper whirled around. "This doesn't concern you, Mrs. Chen. In fact, we need to discuss your lease violations as well." Marcus watched as Cooper stormed off, then helped Mrs. Chen with her mail. "Thank you," he said quietly. "No, thank you," she replied. "You're the only one who stands up to him." Later that day, Marcus received an email from Cooper Management listing his alleged violations: unauthorized overnight guests, excessive noise during quiet hours, unauthorized painting of walls, strong cooking odors, improper garbage disposal, parking violations. Marcus checked his security footage. The cameras had recorded every moment in his apartment for the past 3 months, proving each accusation false. He particularly enjoyed the unauthorized painting claim, considering he hadn't even hung a picture. That evening, Cooper conducted another surprise inspection, this time with 2 maintenance workers in tow. Marcus's cameras captured their entire visit, including Cooper instructing the workers to find something wrong. "The carpet is damaged here," Cooper declared, pointing at a perfectly clean spot. "I don't see any damage," one worker said, looking uncomfortable. "Just write it down." Cooper snapped. Marcus observed silently, his hidden cameras recording everything. After they left, he checked his phone. Another text from his company's CFO about their latest acquisition. He had to suppress a laugh at the irony. While Cooper was fabricating carpet damage, Marcus had just closed a deal worth millions. The next morning, Cooper escalated further. He had maintenance workers change Marcus's parking spot to the farthest corner of the lot, claiming it was building policy. When Marcus checked, no other tenants had been reassigned. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped him in the hallway. "They're doing it to us too," she whispered. "Yesterday, Cooper said our children were too noisy playing inside our apartment at 2 p.m. Marcus nodded sympathetically, adding this information to his files. His lawyer had warned him that Cooper might escalate, but the landlord's increasingly obvious discrimination was making their case stronger by the day. That weekend, Cooper installed new security cameras, all coincidentally pointing at the apartments of minority tenants. Marcus noticed none were directed at white tenants' doors. "We're improving security," Cooper announced at a hastily called tenant meeting. "Certain elements have been causing problems." Marcus recorded the meeting on his phone, noting how Cooper's eyes fixed on the minority tenants during this statement. Several white tenants looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Later that night, Marcus sat in his apartment, reviewing the day's footage. His phone buzzed with a message from his company's board. "New government contract approved. Stock value up 15%. Marcus smiled, adding the day's events to his evidence file. Cooper's escalating behavior was becoming more desperate and more documenting. The landlord thought he was tightening the noose around his minority tenants, not realizing he was actually building a perfect case against himself. As Marcus prepared for bed, another warning notice slipped under his door, this time claiming he had violated the resident dress code by wearing gym clothes in the lobby. There was no dress code in the lease agreement. Soon, Marcus whispered to himself, carefully filing the notice with the others. Very soon, the eviction notice arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, exactly as Marcus had anticipated. He stood in his doorway, holding the official-looking document while his hidden cameras recorded Cooper's smug expression. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises," Cooper announced, barely containing his satisfaction. "All lease violations have been documented." Marcus scanned the notice calmly, noting each fabricated violation. Consistent pattern of unauthorized guests. Repeated noise violations during quiet hours. Unauthorized modifications to UMIT. Multiple complaints from neighboring tenants. Violation of community standards. Non-compliance with property regulations. "Mr. Cooper," Marcus said quietly, "could you provide evidence of these violations?" Cooper's face reddened. "Everything is properly documented. If you don't leave voluntarily, we'll pursue legal action." Just then, Sarah from 4A stepped into the hallway. "Evidence? I live next door, and Marcus is the quietest neighbor I've ever had. I've never heard a sound from his apartment." Cooper spun around. "Miss Walker, this is a private matter." "No, it's not," Sarah interrupted. "I've watched you target every non-white tenant in this building. It's disgusting." Marcus's cameras captured Cooper's reaction, the clenched fists, the throbbing vein in his forehead. "Miss Walker, your lease is also up for review." "Are you threatening me now?" Sarah pulled out her phone. "Please continue. I'm recording." Cooper stormed off, leaving Marcus and Sarah in the hallway. "Thank you," Marcus said sincerely. "Don't thank me," Sarah replied. "I should have spoken up sooner. Several of us have been documenting his behavior." Later that day, Marcus watched through his security system as Cooper met with his maintenance staff in the lobby. The cameras picked up every word. "I want them out," Cooper was saying. "These people are ruining my property values. Johnson is the worst, acting like he belongs here. I don't care what you have to do, find violations. Make them up if you have to." One maintenance worker shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we haven't actually found any violations in Mr. Johnson's apartment." "Then you're not looking hard enough," Cooper shouted. "Check the plumbing, the electrical, anything. There must be something wrong." Marcus added the recording to his evidence file, which now filled several digital folders. His phone buzzed, a message from his company's legal team. "All preparations in place. Proceed when ready." That evening, Cooper conducted another emergency inspection of Marcus's apartment. This time, he brought Linda, his secretary, to witness the violations. "Look at this." Cooper pointed to the pristine kitchen counter. "Unauthorized modifications." Linda looked confused. "Sir, that's the original countertop." "Write it down anyway," Cooper snapped. "And these walls, clearly repainted without permission." "They're the same color as when he moved in," Linda protested weakly. Marcus stood silently, his hidden cameras recording every moment. He noticed Linda's increasingly uncomfortable expression as Cooper fabricated violation after violation. After they left, Marcus received texts from both Mrs. Chen and the Rodriguez family. They had also received eviction notices. Each notice cited similar manufactured violations. Marcus sat at his desk, reviewing the day's footage. His phone lit up with another message from his company. Q4 profits exceeded $100 million. New expansion approved. He smiled, thinking about Cooper's reaction when he discovered that his problem tenant was actually worth more than the entire apartment complex. But first, there was work to be done. Marcus opened his laptop and began typing. 2. Legal team. SUBJACT. Discrimination documentation. Attached, please find. 3 months of continuous security footage. Audio recordings of Cooper's discriminatory statements. Photographic evidence of selective enforcement. Testimonials from other tenants. False violation notices and eviction documents. Proof of disparate treatment based on race. Just as he finished the email, another notice slipped under his door. This one claimed he had suspicious packages delivered to his apartment. Actually, just his regular grocery delivery service. Marcus added the new notice to his file. Tomorrow, he would contact the other evicted tenants. Together, They would show Cooper that he had picked the wrong person to harass. Outside his window, Cooper was instructing maintenance to change the locks on Mrs. Chen's apartment, not realizing that every action he took only strengthened the case against him. Time for Phase 2, Marcus whispered, pressing send on the email to his legal team. The law office of Henderson and Associates occupied the entire top floor of a downtown high-rise. Marcus sat in the conference room with 5 other tenants from Oakwood Heights, while his lawyer, Catherine Henderson, laid out their strategy. Mrs. Chen dabbed at her eyes. He changed my locks yesterday. I had to sleep at my daughter's house. He told us our children couldn't play in the community playground, Mrs. Rodriguez added, her husband nodding grimly beside her. Marcus watched as Catherine organized their collective evidence. His own documentation formed the backbone of the case, hundreds of hours of video footage, audio recordings, and meticulously logged incidents. This morning, Cooper's lawyer contacted us, Catherine announced. They're claiming all evictions are due to legitimate lease violations. But we have proof they're lying, Sarah interjected. As the only white tenant in the group, she had become a key witness. I've lived there 3 years and never received a single violation notice. The conference room door opened, and a paralegal rushed in with breaking news. Mr. Cooper just filed counter-suits against all of them, she announced. He's claiming defamation and lease violations totaling $500,000 in damages. Instead of looking worried, Catherine smiled. Perfect. This gives us grounds for discovery. We can demand access to all his rental records. Marcus noticed the other tenants' concerned faces. They hadn't expected Cooper to fight back so aggressively. Don't worry, he assured them. This is exactly what we wanted. Later that day, they attended the first court hearing. Cooper sat on the opposite side with his legal team, looking confident until Catherine presented their initial evidence. Your Honor, Catherine addressed the judge. We have video evidence of Mr. Cooper instructing his staff to fabricate violations. We have audio recordings of him making explicitly racist statements. We have documentation showing systematic discrimination in maintenance responses, rent increases, and enforcement of rules. Cooper's lawyer jumped up. These recordings were made without consent, Your Honor. One-party consent is legal in this state, Catherine countered. And the recordings were made in common areas where there's no expectation of privacy. The judge reviewed the initial evidence. This is deeply troubling, she noted. Mr. Cooper, these allegations are very serious. Cooper leaned forward, whispering urgently to his lawyer. Marcus could see sweat forming on his forehead. During the lunch break, Cooper's lawyer approached Catherine. We're willing to discuss a settlement, he offered quietly. Not interested, Catherine replied. We're going to trial. Back in the courtroom, Catherine dropped their biggest bombshell. We've identified 27 former tenants who experienced similar discrimination at Oakwood Heights over the past 5 years. They're all willing to testify. The color drained from Cooper's face. His lawyer requested a brief recess, which the judge granted. He's panicking, Marcus observed as they waited. He never expected us to fight back this hard. Catherine nodded. Wait until he sees what else we have. Our forensic accountant found evidence of systematic rent gouging targeting minority tenants. When court resumed, Cooper's lawyer tried a new strategy. Your Honor, my client is willing to rescind all eviction notices and implement new anti-discrimination policies. Too late, Catherine responded. We're seeking punitive damages and a complete investigation of all Mr. Cooper's properties. The judge set a trial date for the following month and ordered Cooper to cease all eviction proceedings immediately. As they left the courthouse, Marcus noticed reporters gathering. The case had attracted local media attention, exactly as planned. Mr. Johnson, one reporter called out, is it true that Cooper management has a history of discrimination? Marcus stepped forward, delivering the response they had carefully prepared. This case isn't just about us. It's about every tenant who has ever faced housing discrimination. We're fighting for justice. Back at the law office, Catherine reviewed their next steps. Cooper's lawyer will try to drag this out, wear us down. Are you all prepared for a long fight? Everyone nodded. Marcus looked around at the determined faces of his fellow tenants, thinking about how Cooper had unknowingly chosen the worst possible target for his discrimination. His phone buzzed with another company update, but he ignored it. Right now, he wasn't a millionaire CEO, he was just one of many tenants fighting for their rights. Cooper thought he could bully us into leaving, Mrs. Chen said softly. He didn't expect us to stand together. Marcus smiled. The legal battle was just beginning, but they had already won the most important victory. They had refused to be victims. The courtroom fell silent as Catherine Henderson stood up for their key presentation. The trial had been going for 2 weeks, and today was the moment Marcus had been waiting for. Your Honor, we'd like to call Marcus Johnson to the stand, Catherine announced. Marcus walked to the witness box, feeling Cooper's glare following him. He had worn his simplest suit again, maintaining his IT specialist appearance one last time. Mr. Johnson, Catherine began, please tell the court what you do for a living. Cooper's lawyer suddenly sat up straighter, sensing something was wrong. I am the CEO and founder of TechVision Solutions, Marcus stated clearly. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Cooper's face went from red to white in seconds. His lawyer frantically began flipping through papers. For the record, Catherine continued, what is the current value of TechVision Solutions? As of this morning, our company is valued at $85 million, Marcus replied calmly. Cooper grabbed his lawyer's arm, whispering furiously. The judge called for order as the courtroom buzzed with excitement. Mr. Johnson, Catherine went on. Could you afford the rent at Oakwood Heights? Marcus smiled. I could have purchased the entire complex in cash. Then why did you rent an apartment there? Because after hearing about housing discrimination from my employees, I wanted to experience and document it firsthand. Catherine projected Marcus's detailed spreadsheets onto the courtroom screen. These records show every discriminatory incident over 3 months. Could you explain your documentation method? For the next hour, Marcus walked the court through his evidence. His hidden cameras had captured every fake inspection, every fabricated violation, every discriminatory comment Cooper had made. Your Honor, Cooper's lawyer interrupted. This was clearly a setup. The judge peered over her glasses. A setup that merely recorded your client's own actions? Continue, Mr. Johnson. Marcus explained how Cooper had treated white tenants differently, providing maintenance records showing dramatic differences in response times. He presented rent increase data showing minority tenants faced higher hikes. During the lunch break, reporters swarmed outside the courthouse. The story had gone viral. Millionaire CEO goes undercover to expose housing discrimination. Cooper sat alone in the hallway, his legal team huddled in desperate discussion. His entire discriminatory system had been exposed by the one person he never suspected. Back in session, Catherine played their final piece of evidence, a security recording of Cooper instructing his staff to find any reason to evict minority tenants. We also have testimonies from former employees, Catherine announced, detailing Mr. Cooper's systematic discrimination over the past decade. Cooper's lawyer requested another recess, but the judge denied it. The evidence was overwhelming. Mr. Johnson, the judge asked, what do you hope to achieve with this case? Marcus leaned forward. Your Honor, this isn't about money. It's about justice. Housing discrimination happens every day to people who can't fight back. I had the resources to expose it, but most victims don't. As he stepped down from the witness stand, Marcus caught Sarah's eye in the gallery. She gave him a thumbs up, while Mrs. Chen and the Rodriguez family smiled proudly. Cooper couldn't even look at Marcus as he passed by. His carefully constructed system of discrimination had been dismantled by the very person he tried to evict. Outside the courthouse, Marcus finally answered his phone. His company's board wanted to issue a press statement about the case. Tell them to wait, he instructed. This isn't about TechVision. It's about changing the system. Catherine joined him with news. Cooper's lawyer is begging for a settlement meeting. They're terrified of the publicity. Marcus shook his head. No settlements. We're seeing this through to the end. As they walked back into the courthouse, Marcus thought about all the people who had faced discrimination without the means to fight it. His wealth had allowed him to expose the truth, but the real victory would be changing the system for everyone else. The revelation of his identity had shocked the courtroom, but the real shock was yet to come, when Cooper and other discriminatory landlords realized they couldn't get away with their practices anymore. Cooper's legal team requested an emergency meeting 2 days after Marcus's identity revelation. They gathered in Judge Martinez's chambers. where Cooper's demeanor had changed dramatically from his previous arrogance to near desperation. "My client is prepared to offer a generous settlement," Cooper's lawyer announced, sliding a document across the table. $5 million, split among all the tenants, plus immediate cancellation of all eviction notices. Marcus glanced at the paper without touching it. Catherine Henderson sat beside him, her expression neutral but alert. "We're also willing to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination policies," Cooper added quickly, wiping sweat from his forehead. "New staff training, regular audits." "Mr. Cooper," Marcus interrupted calmly, "do you know why I chose your building?" Cooper shifted uncomfortably. "I assume it was to set me up." "No, I chose Oakwood Heights because 6 different civil rights organizations identified it as having the highest number of discrimination complaints in the city. You weren't just discriminating against us, you've been doing it for years." Judge Martinez watched the exchange with interest while Catherine pulled out another folder. "We found 43 families who were forced out of Oakwood Heights in the past 5 years, Catherine stated. "All minorities, all through fabricated violations. Your pattern goes back much further than our case." Cooper's lawyer tried to intervene. "The statute of limitations doesn't apply when there's evidence of ongoing discrimination," Catherine finished. "We have that evidence." Marcus stood up, walking to the window. "Here's our counteroffer. Full compensation for all previous victims. A public admission of discrimination. Mandatory sale of all your properties to a fair housing organization. An establishment of a foundation to help fight housing discrimination." "That would bankrupt me," Cooper protested. "Actually," Marcus turned back to face him, "it would leave you with about $2 million. More than enough to start over, somewhere else." The room fell silent. Judge Martinez studied both parties carefully. "If you refuse," Catherine added, "we continue the trial. Every piece of evidence becomes public record. Every former tenant testifies. Every discriminatory practice gets exposed in detail." Cooper's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Cooper was staring at Marcus. "Why did you do this? You could have bought any apartment, any building." "Because money shouldn't determine whether someone gets fair treatment," Marcus replied. "My daughter will grow up in a world where her skin color doesn't decide where she can live." Mrs. Chen and the Rodriguez family waited anxiously outside with Sarah and the other tenants. When Marcus emerged from the chamber, they all stood up. "He's accepting our terms," Marcus announced. "All of them." The celebration was quiet but heartfelt. Mrs. Rodriguez hugged her children. Mrs. Chen wiped away tears. Sarah high-fived Marcus. Catherine started explaining the details. Cooper would sell all his properties within 90 days. A fair housing organization would manage them, with current tenants given the option to stay under protected leases. The new Anti-Discrimination Foundation would be funded with $5 million from Cooper's assets. "What about the other landlords like him?" Mrs. Chen asked softly. Marcus smiled. "That's phase 2. This case sets a precedent. Other landlords will realize they can't hide discrimination anymore." As they left the courthouse, reporters again crowded around them. This time, Marcus stepped forward willingly. "Today's settlement isn't just about Oakwood Heights," he announced. "It's a message to every landlord who thinks they can discriminate without consequences. That era is ending." Later that evening, Marcus sat in his modest apartment, looking at the eviction notices that had started it all. His phone buzzed with messages from his company's board. The publicity was actually helping their business as people learned about their CEO's commitment to social justice. Catherine called with news that 3 other landlords in the city had suddenly implemented new anti-discrimination policies. The ripple effect was beginning. A text from Sarah appeared. "Cooper's cleaning out his office right now. Karma is beautiful." Marcus smiled, thinking about all the future families who would now have a fair chance at housing. The settlement wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. Tomorrow, he would start planning the foundation structure. But tonight, he celebrated quietly, knowing that sometimes justice comes in unexpected packages. 6 months after the landmark settlement, Marcus stood at the podium in front of the renovated Oakwood Heights, now renamed Unity Gardens. A large crowd had gathered for the official opening of the Fair Housing Foundation's headquarters in Cooper's former office. "When I moved here last year," Marcus began, "I saw discrimination in action. Today, We're turning that same space into a center for housing justice. The crowd included many familiar faces. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, beaming proudly. The Rodriguez children held up a colorful thank you banner. Sarah stood with a group of tenant rights activists she had joined after the case. Catherine Henderson stepped up to share the foundation's first-year achievements. In just 6 months, we've helped 25 families fight housing discrimination. We've audited 15 apartment complexes and implemented fair housing policies in all of them. 3 discriminatory landlords have settled cases rather than face court battles. Marcus watched Cooper's former tenants in the audience. Many were crying happy tears. Some had moved back to Unity Gardens under the new management. Others had found homes elsewhere but came back to celebrate. Mrs. Rodriguez took the microphone next. My children now play in the same playground where they were once told they weren't welcome. This is what justice looks like. The Foundation's office, once Cooper's domain of discrimination, had been transformed. Where Cooper once plotted evictions, housing advocates now help families fight for their rights. The wall that once held fake violation notices now displayed resources and success stories. But our work isn't finished, Marcus continued. Housing discrimination doesn't end with one victory. It ends when every family has a fair chance at a home. He announced the Foundation's expansion plans. New offices in 5 other cities. A legal defense fund for low-income tenants. Training programs to help property managers implement fair housing practices. Sarah shared how the case had changed her. I used